Often, people struggle with the Old Testament. It seems like that God is harsh and quick to judge. But then in the New Testament, we have this loving God who is trying desperately to show us mercy if we will just accept it and receive it. And how do we reconcile that? That this is the same God. But if we look at the Old Testament from that lens of a God who is still trying to show us mercy in the face of our continued rebellion, we start to see it a little bit different. But there are still instances that we see in the Old Testament where God had to react in judgment. Now, we're going to look at one specific one in this episode and why it is so important, because God has this amazing plan for you and I. He's got so much more for us. But we need to understand, in spite of His mercy, we still need to understand that fear of the Lord, understanding His holiness, that doesn't derail you and I from receiving all that He has for us. Psalms tells us that the story of Israel is a lesson in God's ways. So in other words, we can see in the Old Testament how God develops His people, how He's developing you and I, how He's building us into those men and women that could receive all that He has for us, how He matures us that we could receive the authority, that we could receive the inheritance that He has for us. And when we combine that with the New Testament, we have a complete picture of a merciful God, but one who wants to develop us and mature us to receive what He has for us. But there's also moments we see in the Old Testament that can be a little shocking. And we're going to look today at when Moses, now he's so close to receiving all that God had for him. He's so close to going into the promised land, the thing that God called his inheritance. But he struck the rock when God said to speak to it. It seems like a small thing to us. And because of that, he never got to enter into the promised land. Now, let's give it some context. So we're going to look into this. But obviously, as you know, Moses was the leader that God chose to bring His people out of Egypt, out of their past, to take them into their inheritance. And Moses had spent years dealing with these people who continually murmured and complained. We're going to see a little bit of a double standard here, because they continually murmured and complained, and God and Moses both would get frustrated with them. But what do we see? God's continued mercy. And we see that Moses would repeatedly intercede on their behalf. But why were they murmuring and complaining? Because they didn't understand what God was doing. God was trying to teach them to trust Him. He was teaching them that He had everything under control. He would purposely take them to places where their provision ran out. Why? Because He would take them there so that He could provide for them. He took them to places where they couldn't take care of themselves, so He could take care of them, so He could demonstrate His faithfulness. He took them to places where there was no food, no water. Why? To teach them to trust Him so they could receive. See, they couldn't receive what they had until they learned to trust Him at so much of a deeper level. And Moses, not only that, he was also known as a friend of God. How do you go from being a friend of God to missing out? And God actually said about Moses at one point, He actually said, Moses, prophets I speak to through visions and dreams, but Moses I speak to face. So how do you go from that kind of relationship to missing out on God's best? Well, the moment came, and again, they're so close to the promised land. But again, God brought them to a place where there was no water. And what happens? The people murmur, complain, oh, if we still were in Egypt, God brought us here to let us die. And it's all your fault. And they're upset with Moses. So Moses and Aaron go before the Lord, and they fall on their faces. And God says, gather the people together, speak to the rock. I'm going to provide more than enough. He was going to provide enough water for the people, their livestock, everything. There was going to be more than enough. It was going to be another demonstration of God's power, His faithfulness. God was going to be glorified. But what happens? Now, let's also understand how frustrated Moses was. Not only has he spent years dealing with these people complaining, at one point he actually said to God, do I have to take care of these people? If this is the way you're going to deal with me, kill me now because it's more than I can bear. So we've seen frustration bubble up. But what happens? Moses, before the people, he gets angry. He strikes the rock. And before doing so, he yells at them, calls them rebels, and he strikes the rock twice. Now here's what we need to notice. God still provides more than enough for the people. But why? He's holding Moses to a different standard. So he tells Moses that this is in Numbers chapter 20, he's not going to be able to go into the promised land. Why? The New Living Translation says, because you didn't trust me enough to magnify me before the people. The Living Bible says, because you didn't have enough faith to honor me before the people. See, what happened? Moses violated God's holiness, violated God's holy name. Psalms 138 says that God has exalted his name and his word, his name and his promise above everything else. See, Moses, the people, yes, they had murmured and complained for years, but remember, the New Testament tells us that to whom much is given, much is required. For you and I to be those men and women of faith, for us to receive all that God has for us, we will be held to a higher standard. So because of this, even though they were so close, Moses never got to go into the promised land. But remember, he's still a merciful God. And so Moses does get to see, he brings him to where he can see the promised land. But remember, God isn't done with Moses. And when Jesus is in the garden before the crucifixion, who appears to him? It's Moses and Elijah. See, God was still using Moses. But we have a very real potential of missing out on some of what God has for us. And for you and I to continue to mature, we want to be held to that higher standard. We want to grow and mature in authority and responsibility. But it will require a higher standard. To whom much is given, much is required. And we need to understand that in spite of a merciful God, he is still a holy God. And that holiness requires the fear of the Lord on our behalf.